And so Mount St. Helens is in my memory. In fact, we just went by the anniversary of its explosion like a week and a half ago, and I heard it down here.
You heard the noise?
I was working on my sawmill in my uncle's shop, and I thought, what the heck was that? And then when I was driving home, I was listening to the radio, and Mount St. Helens had blown.
Welcome back. We just finished the foundation portion of the spec house, and we want to talk about the dirt work side of it, the export, the excavation, I should say, and compare and kind of discuss what this portion of the project might have looked like if we were doing a different type of foundation. Right. Now, we did a video a long time ago kind of where we made the decision and talked about some of the differences of the main choices, but we'll kind of recap them here briefly and let you explain what the system looks like and how this excavation might have gone differently if we were building that type of foundation. So in the western United States, it seems to me like probably the most common is a slab on grade. Is that true, or is that just what I've seen?
Southwestern United States, slab on grade is really typical residential because the soils are very stable and the weather's dry and it's just conducive to, throwing a concrete slab down and putting a house on it. And it's a faster process. You can it's somewhat easier to mass produce houses slab on grade than it is on crawl spaces.
So what would this excavation and all that digging and all that tractor and the bobcats and all those things, would that have been more or less the same if that's if we were doing a slab on grade, or do you literally just show up with a concrete truck and pour a flat slab right up top where you want the finished floor to be?
So we have, as what we pointed out in probably the first or second video on this project, that we had some concerns about the compaction on the lot. So in order to address that with slab on grade, if it was a conventional slab on grade, rebar, ferrous concrete, slab on grade, there would have been some over excavation. We would have dug it down probably about as far as the upper elevation on our Crawlspace dig.
Oh.
And so we probably would have had, we had 17 loads of export, and so we probably would have had 10 loads, maybe 9 or 10 loads of export to get down, and then brought in a whole bunch of structural fill to bring the grade right back up pretty much to where it was, with a crushed base to provide kind of a pillow, a giant snowshoe for the conventional slab on grade to kind of float on. If we would have done post-tension, it wouldn't have required that much. We probably would have just done enough of that to sort of make it just easier to work on, control mud and make the grading easy and that sort of thing, and then count it on the post-tension to withstand cracking, and the whole thing. The slab itself would have been the snowshoe. It wouldn't have made any difference what the lot did underneath. The whole thing would have gone with it. So it would have been a different excavation picture for a different cause.
But it still would have been that full-size excavator and dump trucks.
Same
and
equipment.
It still would have taken the same crew, probably more than a day.
Yeah.
So, marginally, it's you're kind of all the same guys and the same equipment,
That's
sort
right.
of, right? I'm sure it would have been a little less expensive, but...
Well, bring it, half the export but twice the import of the structural rock. The excavation probably would have been... Excavation bill probably would have been a little more. We would have had the same effort on utility lines, same effort on drains, curtain drain around the boundary.
Right.
So probably a little more expensive to do a nice preparation for a conventional slab on grade, less expensive for the site prep with the post-tension, though. That would have been a significant cost savings to have prepped the site for slab on grade.
Okay, interesting. Okay, sounds good. Now, I have zero experience with basements, and I don't even know how many basements exist in Southern Oregon here. It seems like they're not as common as they once were, maybe?
They're not that common. It's interesting. So this country had lumber. We have been awash in lumber. 1946, there were 243 sawmills operating in our county. 243.
Yeah.
And now there's like 7, 6 maybe. But lumber was everywhere, and it was cheap, and so people would just build on the slope, however the land, and backhoes didn't, in practical terms, even exist. So people would pretty much build on the site as it was and post and beam up. piers
Oh,
and
right.
posts and beams, because we had lumber, and we would just plop it on the ground, and then the black mud would do whatever it would do, and the old houses were they were all over the place. So
And they still are.
and they still are. That's right.
Yeah.
So then foundations came along, and I guess it was kind of a mentality that we minimized dirt work because dirt work was expensive. There wasn't that much heavy equipment here per se, except logging.
Probably really heavy, like you mentioned, a lot of the heavy equipment that's used now, these bobcats, these mini excavators, that's probably relatively recent.
Very recent. Backhoes still are, but those mini excavators and a skid steer or a bobcat
Yeah.
is just a killer team for small to medium excavations. But it didn't exist. You couldn't handle the dirt as easily then as you
Wow.
can now. And this was always this is a new community, right? I mean, my friends the Shrums and the Livingstons up in Glide got here in 1865, and they were about the first.
Wow.
So people haven't been here a long time, really building
Yeah.
in a permanent way.
Yeah, that's funny. And there's some criticism internationally about United States building standards of not building 500-year buildings, and that's
Interesting.
fair, because
Sure.
old Europe, there's homes that were built 1,000 years ago that people are still cooking pizzas in or whatever it is. But you got to imagine the first people, like your friends the Shrums, they're much more worried about getting their cattle fed and their garden grown than they are
That's
building
right.
a 500-year home.
That's
They're
right.
kind of thinking, actually, we want to just get out of the rain. So
That's right. Yeah, I mean,
it's not too surprising. Whereas in a civilization that's already been in place in this city for 800 years,
That's right.
you might be able to I don't know, have your needs taken care of a little differently than in the Wild West, so to speak.
I was thinking about that with this YouTube channel. The way life has changed for me now, concentrating on YouTube, that I have now more time to take care of some maintenance and some infrastructure than I've had in a long time, because there were always pressing demands because of the other places I was being pulled. And so maybe that's the same thing. In the old world, there was, if not more discretionary time, at least less infrastructure need pressing on you all the time.
Yeah,
maybe.
that's right. Okay, interesting. So a basement, if we were bound and determined, and let's say that it was like the owner wanted you to build them a basement on that lot, that's almost easier for me to visualize. I guess they just would have kept digging deeper, and then what would that excavation have looked like compared to what we saw in our video?
Okay, so basements. I kind of glossed over. We were talking about basements. There aren't that many here because of how much water falls from the sky and because of how much clay soil there is.
Oh.
And so you dig down into clay soil with a lot of rain, you're making a swimming pool first is really what you're making. So water exclusion out of a basement around here has always been problematic. And there are more daylight basements here than full basements under a house. And that lot would have been really ideal for a daylight basement, to dig back into the hill, push it back into that hill, maybe, 20 feet, 25 feet. So the back third or half or 60% of the house is a basement with a walkout feature. So you have daylight in the front part of the basement, but additional space under the house. And that'd put the second story of your house at ground level at the hill, and the first story of your house, the basement, ground level coming out into the front.
Yeah.
So a tri-level or a split level in that way would have worked well. But it wasn't. Okay, so the excavation would have looked different because the excavation would have immediately been happening in rock.
Oh.
We got right into shale on that uphill retaining
so
wall.
that's the question. I wasn't able to see in the video what was shale and what was dirt, but you're saying there was shale right away, kind of at the top?
So remember the 5-foot retaining wall on the
Yes.
west side of the lot. As we were digging back into the toe of the hill right there to put that cantilevered footing in there, we were in shale. And by the time we got up to the north end of that dig, the shale was beginning to smoke. That is, it was turning into basalt. It was getting really hard. So if we would have crowded that back into the hill, it would have been probably a hoe ram. It wouldn't have been drill and blast, but we would have been hoe ramming a hydraulic breaker, breaking rock out of that hillside to push the daylight basement back in there, which is expensive, but stable. I mean, the whole house would have been back on very firm
You
grade.
can get more square footage for. I mean, it's also a lot of work to build up. Okay, Leo's got a question for you.
What's your question, Sonny?
Papa,
Talk right in the mic. Right in the mic.
why are there those dots right there?
The dots through the barn wall? A lot of people have asked me about those holes. Is this the time to reveal the answer to that question?
Give him like a one-sentence answer.
That's a shotgun blast right through the end of my barn wall.
He shot it with a gun.
And I did it And we'll tell you the rest of that. Never do that, son. Never shoot a shotgun through the end of your barn, okay?
All right.
Let me just say this. It was not an accident.
It seemed like a good idea at the time.
That's right.
Is there a component to building a basement in more extreme climates where they're warmer in the winter, colder in the summer? That's always been sort of like felt like an added bonus. But in other parts of the country, is that like maybe why is that part of like the?
So I think so. I mean, the Midwest.
Yeah.
So in Wyoming, basements were very common. The soil was kind of sandy and granular, and so this was I moved back there in 1981. That was before excavators were everywhere.
Right.
But the guy in Powell, Wyoming, I can't think of his name, who did most of the excavation, had a big wheel loader, probably a Cat 930 equivalent, and he would just start digging with the front end of that wheel tractor, and he would just dig a ramp down and then just start digging the basement from the bottom grade. He would dig from the bottom grade. He would ramp down and just start digging it out of there.
And then dig the ramp out like by hand or something maybe?
Well, no, I mean, he would start digging a ramp, 60
Right.
feet back from the basement.
Oh, I see.
And he would just
Oh, okay. And
ramp
then
down
just
to basement
backfill it when
grade.
he's done.
And he
Got
would
it.
just run in and out, and he would spread it on the lot or put it in a dump truck.
Yeah.
And he'd walk away, and there would be this nice square-shouldered basement hole in the ground, and we would do very little site prep below that because he was scraping it nice and tight.
Yeah.
It was essentially native, 6.5 or 7 feet below grade. It was hard.
Wow.
And the drainage, we never did anything about drainage in Wyoming.
Wow.
Northwestern Wyoming, whatever rain fell,
Yeah.
never got down that far, and if it did, it just kept falling.
Interesting.
And cold weather, you're right. A basement in Powell, Wyoming was a cozy place in the winter.
So I'm sure these different regions, there's just more to it there's a lot of factors into going. The soil itself, the contractors available, the equipment. I was told a story, and I don't know if it's true, but it made sense about Phoenix and why there's not a lot of basements there, because the soil's actually good. There's not a lot of caliche, at least not as much as in Vegas. And it's so hot, and basements stay cool. And it's kind of a standard question, head scratching, nobody knows the answer. And one guy told me that 60 years ago, there was a basement contractor who was terrible, and he built a lot of basements and just did a terrible job, and they all leaked in the monsoons. And this was when Phoenix was being really developed, and it got such a bad name for basements in general that people just came away thinking they don't work in Phoenix. And so for a big series of decades, that was the conventional wisdom until I don't know. Again, I was told this story, but it kind of makes sense.
So there could be truth to that.
Yeah.
I mean, traditions and culture and habits and expectations get kind of cemented.
Yeah, and especially today we can relatively easy research questions like this and get a hold of experts, but back 50 years ago, you're limited to who in your community knew anything about basements, and if that person gave you this advice, like, oh, they always leak, don't do it.
Yeah.
And then what are you going to do?
Yeah.
You're going to take that person's advice,
That's right.
and that's kind of, so I don't know if that's true, but I'm sure it could be.
Well, I learned when you were living down there that the monsoons are no joke. Man, when it rains down there.
Yeah, it really does.
And I can see where there'd be some wet basements if they hadn't prepared for that.
There's just flooding that happens anyways. People's homes will, just drainage in general, and people. And I owned property that in one monsoon in particular I had 3 apartments with water running in the front door.
Wow.
And these were apartments that were built in the 50s, and I don't know if it had happened before, but it happened then, it just happens, and it's middle of the city. All right, let's circle back to our property, and we chose a crawl space, and it made a lot of sense at the time, and it still does. And we didn't actually mention there is another advantage for this crawl space compared to the slab on grade that you talked about in terms of the general weight, because a lot of dirt came out of that, and I'm assuming here that nothing else is really going back in except for around the edges. But talk about our crawl space. We're going to really get into the differential settlement issue in our engineering video.
Okay.
But go over that as well, because I think for this site, it has become extra clear that this really is the perfect foundation system, all things considered.
Yeah, I think so. So Dave Thomas is our engineer. He's the structural guy that solved all of the calculations on the house itself, including he and I spent a lot of time talking about differential settlement, because the the edge, the corner of the lot that's out by where it's all retained is not as hard, and there's a lot of big fill out there. And the back of the house on the west side is right down against a shale, so there's going to be the potential for zero settlement in the back and some marginal amount of settlement out in the front. There's also the idea that we don't want to throw a whole bunch of additional loading against that whole rock and retaining wall system. It'll take it. It has a safety margin of 2 to 1 built into it at least. How did that go? Yeah, I think it's 2 or 2.5 to 1 is the safety margin on that wall, and it's standing up beautifully, but we didn't want to add to that with the weight of a house. So Dave Thomas is the first guy. This is one of the things that's impressed me about Dave. He's articulated a couple things to me, engineering concepts that I've heard other engineers speak to, and when they're done talking, you're not really sure you understood what they said. But Dave has the ability to boil it down so that it's understandable for me at least. And so the first thing he pointed out was, with a crawl space like that we dig down far enough so that the stem wall gets a little taller than normal, which does 2 things. We ended up hauling 17 loads of material out of there, exporting. 17 loads with a conservative estimate of 10 yards. Let's say it's kind of fluffy and not that heavy. Let's say that it's about 2,500 pounds per yard.
Okay.
That's 25,000 pounds of dirt per load times 17 loads is 425,000 pounds of dirt that went off that lot. 425,000 pounds. The lot was lightened by that amount. Okay, now that's good for retaining. And then you add back in the weight of the house, which Google tells me is somewhere around 125,000 pounds, and the weight of the foundation, which I know, and of around 82,000 pounds, and the weight of the fill. What it boils down to is we've reduced the net load on that lot by about 150,000 pounds.
Wow.
Less weight when the house is on there than there was when the house was not there. He pointed out that's an engineering advantage. So that's that's one reason to have done that excavation.
Yeah.
But is that a compelling reason? No. The compelling reason is we've excavated it far enough that those stem walls get stronger and stronger, acting as a beam. So you essentially have, on the downhill side, we have 6 courses of block. On the uphill side, we have 4 courses. That's enough to develop a lot of strength that'll distribute any of the loads in that house across the entire footing. And if some portion of that footing settles a little bit for some combination of reasons, the strength of the stem wall, given it that height, is going to bridge and distribute and make even and reduce to 0, we expect, any settlement issues that could happen because of uneven site conditions. That's the big reason. And then there's the other thing that the channel pointed out is slab on grade is great until you ever have a mechanical problem. There's no remodeling, there's no retrofitting, you get a leak in your plumbing under your slab, you're hurt. So in this crawl space, there's going to be lots of room to move around and address HVAC and plumbing and electrical.
Yeah, that's worth something. It's not just a crawl space, it's kind of a spacious and roomy and like very accessible crawl space with the added bonus of I don't know if it's net 0 then on our house, but relatively with the soil that came out, or did your numbers show that with the house back, it's kind of like the same difference?
It's lighter.
It's lighter.
It's 150,000 pounds lighter with the house there than it was without the house there.
Wow.
The lot becomes buoyant, right? It's good.
Yeah,
it's happy.
So that's great. Very, very cool. All right. Plus, this probably is the most standard building method around here.
It is.
In other words, this house will go for sale. It'll hit the market, and people are very used to seeing a slab on grade, or a crawl space. Had we done a post tension, there might have been a little bit of uneasiness among somebody about whether it was a good idea.
There would have been a lot of conversation.
Yeah.
There would have been conversation, and conversation is, conversation leads in places that you may or may not want to go sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay. Great.
And then the other thing is the crawl space is going to be dry. We have been effective in diverting all the water around the sides. We're going to have additional footing drains and roof water drains. The crawl space will be dry. It's graveled. It's compacted. There'll be a heavy vapor barrier. It's going to be a pretty hospitable environment.
Now, I don't know if we'll make videos about this, but the viewers might be interested that this street that the house is on, the opposite side in particular, there have been some issues with some houses with their foundation, with their compaction. They built their homes without this. We have the only big retaining wall like this. Some other homes have solved this in different ways, but yeah, it feels good to have a house not only with this bulletproof retaining, but also now lighter than when we showed up.
That's right.
And it's all and
That's right. That's right. And
it's
it's further up the valley, so there's less drainage. You know,
Yes.
there's less overburden of hillside and drainage, and we're on the west side of the valley where there's not the same soil condition that we have on the east side of the valley, and so
well, it's shale, like you said, and
Yeah.
it was very clear in that retaining wall video. When he was digging that with the excavator, you could just see it chipping off.
Yep.
I mean, and that so clearly that continues at the same slope down the hillside.
Yep.
And that's pretty interesting. You know, we should learn more and then chat about this. And I was just putting it together when you were describing that. But is that kind of how this works? The dirt compacts into shale, which then compacts into basalt around here. Is that sort of how the geology works?
So I don't know, but what I think is, you know, so that's really it. Basalt is volcanic.
Oh.
Basalt is frozen lava.
Oh, okay.
And the basalt freezes differently depending on if it's coming up into water
Right.
and chills. You get columnar basalt
Right.
if it's coming up and freezes rapidly. So the shale and the clays, I don't know how that develops, but there seems to be some sort of a sandstone-like element of the shale under pressure for a period of time.
But probably if the basalt is volcanic, that answers that. The shale is not volcanic. I'm sure it has
Sedimentary.
and bits of the basalt in it, but
Yeah.
I didn't realize basalt was volcanic. That's
Yeah.
pretty neat.
It is.
Well,
It's good
this whole Cascade Mountain range and the whole Pacific Rim. I mean,
Ring of
if
fire.
you fly over this part of Oregon, you can just see it like in a line, volcanoes, like
yeah.
in a straight line.
That's right.
From I guess Shasta, probably further.
Yeah.
That's the first one I could think of.
Yeah, well, say Shasta, but
All the way up to Rainier and actually all the way up to Alaska.
all the way,
all of it.
the Aleutians, all of it,
Yeah.
and then back down the other side. You know, the Ring of Fire, all the way around the Pacific.
It's really cool flying over that because you look out one side of the airplane and bing, 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 especially in
Yeah.
the summertime. And you look out the other side, bing, bing, bing. And I know that's how maybe every mountain range is. There's the peaks, but
Yeah.
for some reason right here, it's more clear to me that they're volcanoes.
And they're iconic. You know, they come at the angle of repose of volcanic ash.
Yeah.
You know, solidified and basalt and you know, pyroclastic flows and all that nastiness. You can just see, bam, there's a shape until you come to Mount St. Helens. Then in 1,500 feet of the top of that thing is
Right.
gone.
Yeah, or Crater Lake.
That's right. And so Mount St. Helens is in my memory. In fact, we just went by the anniversary of its explosion like a week and a half ago, and
Yeah.
I heard it down here.
You heard the noise?
I was working on my sawmill in my uncle's shop, and I thought, what the heck was that? And then when I was driving home, I was listening to the radio, and Mount St. Helens had blown.
Do you remember making any assumptions about what it might have been, like a shotgun or something, or was it too
No,
different?
It was just different, and it was almost subliminal. You know, it was really low pitched, and I thought, what was that? You know, I didn't know. But once I heard what it was, and I connected the dots, I thought, I just heard a volcano go off. What was that? That was 180 and 240 miles north of me.
Wow.
It was awesome. But I didn't visit the site until Kelly and I took a 35th anniversary trip 6 years ago up to Tacoma, Seattle area, where she went to school, where we lived when we were first married. And we took that drive up to Mount St. Helens, and it was stunning.
Yeah.
I just really regret that I didn't get up there sooner.
Yeah.
And I know a guy that we may someday introduce on the channel, Steve Atkins, who was up there working for Weyerhaeuser, cutting timber in that volcanic ash, salvaging the zillions of board feet of timber that had been just flattened by that explosion, working up to his hips in ash and destroying one chainsaw every month from sucking the dust in through the filter. He has some
so
cool stories.
the trees were flattened and busted off at the stumps, more
sheared
or
off
less.
at the stump. Boom.
And he was out there trying to get chokers around them, and
Yeah.
Weyerhaeuser was trying to
Yeah.
run them through a mill and
Yep.
get their money worth out of them.
Weyerhaeuser mobilized in a huge way.
They probably made a killing, honestly.
They owned the timber before, so they didn't actually make anything.
Yeah.
But they saved a killing.
Well, they didn't have to pay a faller.
Well, but
I know.
right, but but they had to pay. Mother Nature did a crappy job of falling that timber. But man, he's got some stories. It was really, I mean, physically digging the ash away to get in there and buck the log lengths. You know.
Wow.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, that's pretty neat. All right. Any other thoughts? We haven't released this video yet, so for the listeners, there might be some really common questions that are popping up that we haven't seen yet. We'll try to circle back if there are. And these podcasts, we're putting them on YouTube in case you haven't got that message, but you can watch them on our second channel, EC2, and we'll be kind of monitoring those comments and getting feedback. This is a sort of a test. We've talked a lot about this spec house project and tried to figure out how we can maximize the value. And like we maybe said in the previous episode, there's just a lot of information that isn't going to make it to the final videos, but we want to still try to get that out as best we can. So if any of you listeners have ideas or feedback or thoughts on how we can help do this better or differently, or even feedback about the way we've done this discussion, comments on YouTube would probably be the best place to pass that information along for the time being.
Yeah, I think so. And if you have comments or observations or suggestions that you want us to extend to any of the subcontractors that you see, because you're getting acquainted with Brian and Dexter, and you'll be getting acquainted with dozens of other guys. I mean, we can relay that to them, and the fact is we'll probably have them sitting in here giving you their perspective on what they're doing in their world, in their livelihood, in their trade, in their approach to construction.
Oh, one thing I wanted to mention, and maybe we'll get this in the video somehow, but your excavator has done a lot of this type of stuff, but this is not like his day in, day out. These types of machinery and equipment collections kind of do all sorts of different jobs. Are house pad dig outs like this just kind of like a normal weekly thing for an excavation contractor, or is this sort of is this right in his wheelhouse, or is he used to kind of more different type of like road building, or what exactly does he do? He has such a collection of equipment. It seems like you can't be an expert in everything, but how does that work?
He is kind of a generalist. He's not become specific in his approach to excavation. He'll set the rocks, he'll dig a house pad, he'll put in a little road, he'll put in a septic system, he'll put a big French drain across your property. He'll do any of those things. There in larger economies, there's room for people to specialize. But my experience here as a contractor, and I see it happening for Brian also, is that you have to be ready to do almost whatever the phone call brings, or at least take a swipe at it. And between his experience and Dexter's experience in the C-Led excavator or in the skid steer, they can do about anything.
And I guess that explains the assortment of equipment, because if he was only doing one type of thing, it might make sense to only have one type of machine or two that could get it done. But for an assortment of jobs, you need to be prepared with an assortment of tools.
True.
Yeah.
True. Yeah.
Okay, well, we're going to wrap it up. Thanks, everybody, for listening. And if you have questions or feedback, like I said, why don't you put them in the comments of the YouTube video, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thanks a million.